The intercept came in at 5:14. Not a drone feed, not a satellite ping. A single line of Russian radio traffic, voice, unencrypted. A junior officer telling someone above him that the vehicles were already in the water, already crossing. The 412th Nemesis UAV Battalion's signals team flagged it within 40 seconds. By the time the duty officer at the 24th King Danylo Mechanized Brigade's forward command post read the transcript, the lead elements of Russia's 98th Guards Airborne Division were committed to the Siverskyi Donets-Donbas Canal west of Chasiv Yar, and there was no pulling them back. 27 BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, one canal, one morning, and a Ukrainian brigade that had spent the previous 11 days preparing for exactly this. What followed over the next 9 hours would be studied in after-action rooms from Kiev to Brussels, a sensor strike engagement in which Ukraine's 24th King Danylo Mechanized Brigade absorbed a battalion-sized Russian airborne assault without committing a single tank of its own to the contact line. By midday, open-source footage confirmed at least 19 BMP-3 hulls inside the canal embankment corridor. The rest had been abandoned by their crews, who withdrew on foot through the marshland to the east, leaving behind equipment worth tens of millions of dollars. But here is the question that the wreckage raises. The question that makes this engagement matter beyond the body count and the burned metal. The BMP-3 is not a bad vehicle. It carries a 100 mm 2A70 low-pressure gun, a coaxial 30 mm 2A72 autocannon, modern thermal sighting systems, and it can swim. It was designed explicitly for water obstacle crossings. Russia's 98th Guards Airborne is not a conscript formation scraped together from a mobilization depot. It is one of the most decorated airborne divisions in the Russian order of battle, with a lineage running through Afghanistan and Chechnya and the early weeks of this war. So why, on an overcast morning in late May 2025, did 27 of their vehicles enter a canal corridor and fail to come out the other side? The answer is not in the vehicle, it is in the doctrine. And the doctrine is what this investigation is about. The Siverskyi Donets-Donbas Canal is a Soviet-era engineering project completed in 1958, running roughly southwest from the city of Sloviansk toward the Bakhmut district. West of Chasiv Yar, the canal cuts through flat, low-lying ground, former industrial farmland now stripped to mud and mine craters. The embankment walls on both sides run to approximately 4 meters in height at the crossing points Russia's planners selected. The canal itself is between 18 and 22 meters wide at those locations and roughly 3 meters deep, navigable for BMP-class vehicles in swim mode but tight. The approach corridors on the eastern bank, where Russian forces would have to mass before entering the water, are exposed for between 300 and 600 meters depending on which crossing point you examine on the deep state map overlays published in the days after the engagement. For 11 days before the assault, the 24th King Danylo Brigade's drone company and attached elements from the 412th Nemesis UAV Battalion had been mapping every meter of those approach corridors. Not guessing, mapping. The difference matters enormously. By the third week of May, Ukrainian ISR assets, a mix of commercial Mavic 3 Enterprise units, modified FPV reconnaissance variants, and at least 2 fixed-wing Leleka 100 loitering observation platforms, had built what analysts at the 24th's intelligence section called a pattern-of-life picture of Russian vehicle movement in the staging areas 4 to 6 kilometers east of the canal. The picture showed the 98th Airborne's transport elements consolidating BMP-3 companies at 2 forward assembly areas near the Chasiv Yar Kostiantynivka road axis. Satellite imagery from commercial providers, cross-referenced by the Deep State Mapping Team and shared through Ukrainian General Staff channels, confirmed that vehicle density at those assembly areas increased sharply between May 18th and May 23rd. I spent time going through the open-source record of this buildup, and one detail kept pulling at me. The Russian staging posture at the eastern assembly areas was essentially identical to what Russian airborne units had used during the Siverskyi crossing attempts in the summer of 2022. Same road axis, same 2-company forward mass, same apparent assumption that speed of crossing would substitute for suppression of the far bank. 3 years into this war, in a sector where Ukrainian drone coverage had expanded by an order of magnitude, the 98th Airborne's planning cell appears to have reached for the same playbook. That is either overconfidence or institutional amnesia. Looking at the outcome, it is hard to call it anything else. Here is what most people get wrong when they analyze this engagement. The 24th King Danylo Brigade did not win this fight by being in the right place with better weapons. They won it by making the Canal corridor into a system before a single Russian vehicle entered the water. That distinction is worth slowing down for, because it is the central lesson of what happened. Between May 20th and May 27th, Ukrainian engineering elements, operating at night in small teams moving on foot through the marshland west of the canal, emplaced remote detonated anti-vehicle mines at 3 points along the western embankment exit ramps. These were not legacy TM-62 pattern mines from Soviet stocks. According to Ukrainian General Staff reporting and subsequent footage analysis by open-source researchers, the mines were newer PT mines with remote arming capability, meaning they could be switched inactive to allow friendly movement and then activated when Russian vehicles began to emerge from the water on the western bank. The engineering teams also placed 2 secondary blocking positions using M18A1 Claymore equivalent directional fragmentation devices at the ramp shoulders, not to stop armor, but to strip the dismounted infantry that would follow the BMP-3s onto the bank. At the same time, the 412th Nemesis UAV Battalion was pre-positioning its FPV strike teams, not at the canal. The FPV operators were set up at covered positions 600 to 900 meters back from the eastern approach corridors, behind the tree line remnants and the ruins of agricultural buildings that still dot this part of the Donbas. Their job was not to hit vehicles in the water, where targeting geometry through spray and thermal wash degrades. Their job was to hit vehicles in the approach queue before they entered, and to hit any survivors attempting to exit east after the crossing failed. And then there was the artillery, the 24th Brigade's organic 155 mm battery, equipped with a mix of M777 towed howitzers and at least one self-propelled unit, had pre-plotted firing solutions for the approach corridors and the exit ramps using survey data provided by the drone company. They were loaded with M483A1 DPICM rounds, dual-purpose improved conventional munitions, each 155 mm shell, releasing 88 submunitions on bursting charge, scattering shaped charge grenades across a zone roughly 100 meters wide. DPICM is specifically lethal against light armor, against BMP-3s massing in a confined corridor. It is not a weapon, it is a condition. The obstacle here was timing. All of this was prepared, but the 24th Brigade's command had no certainty about when the 98th Airborne would commit. Ukrainian drone coverage of the eastern staging areas was good but not continuous. Commercial Mavic batteries run 45 minutes on average, and rotating coverage across multiple observation points meant gaps. According to reporting from Ukrainian military media units embedded with the brigade in late May, there was a period of approximately 18 hours, beginning on the evening of May 26th, when weather suppressed UAV operations almost entirely. Low cloud ceiling, intermittent rain, visibility below 300 meters. If the 98th Airborne had chosen that window to cross, the layered kill system would have been partially blind. They did not choose that window. They crossed at dawn on the morning of May 28th in clearing weather, which is the standard airborne doctrine for forced crossing operations. Better visibility for vehicle commanders navigating swim mode. Better command and control for the crossing force. Standard doctrine, the same doctrine that made them visible to every Ukrainian sensor on the line the moment the cloud ceiling lifted. The first radio intercept reached the 412th signals team at 5:14. By 5:19, the 24th Brigade's duty officer had authorized fire missions. By 5:23, the first DPICM rounds were in the air. Picture what the lead BMP-3 crews experienced in those first minutes. They had entered the approach corridor in column, the way armored vehicles cross water obstacles. You cannot go abreast when the bank narrows to a crossing ramp. Column means the lead vehicle sets the pace for everything behind it. The lead vehicle entered the water, its swim jets engaging, its hull settling lower as the tracks left the mud ramp and the canal took its weight. Across the water, the western bank was quiet. No muzzle flashes, no obvious defensive line. Exactly what the crossing force expected. The first DPICM salvo landed in the eastern approach corridor, 3 vehicles back from the waterline. Among the queue waiting to enter, 88 submunitions per shell, 3 shells in the first battery volley, 264 shaped charge grenades, distributed across a zone roughly 90 meters long by 60 meters wide. The vehicles in that zone were not destroyed in the first salvo. BMP-3 top armor is thin but not paper, but they were stopped, tracks blown, optics destroyed, commanders opening hatches to assess damage, and immediately becoming targets for the FPV teams waiting 600 meters back. Here is the part that does not make sense on the surface, until you understand the geometry. The vehicles that had already entered the water were temporarily safer than the vehicles still on the eastern bank. The canal walls gave them some protection from direct fire, and DPICM is not designed for point targets in water. So the lead elements swam. Some of them reached the western bank, and that is where the remote armed mines were waiting. The first detonation on the western exit ramp was captured by a Ukrainian drone operator at 5:31, 17 minutes after the intercept. The footage, later published by the 24th Brigade's press unit and verified by Deep State, shows a BMP-3 at the top of the western ramp, its forward hull over the bank edge, its swimjet still active, when the mine detonates beneath the forward track assembly. The vehicle does not explode. It stops permanently. It becomes a plug in the exit ramp, blocking the vehicles behind it still in the water. Two more vehicles managed to exit the water at a secondary ramp point approximately 140 meters to the north. Both were engaged by FPV drones within 4 minutes of clearing the water. The 412th Nemesis Battalion's strike footage shows a coordinated double-tap approach. The first drone impacts the engine deck to immobilize. The second, arriving 8 to 12 seconds later, targets the open crew hatch or the commander's sight block. This is not improvised. This is a trained FPV anti-armor sequence developed and refined by Ukrainian drone units over the previous 18 months of canal and obstacle fighting in this sector. What strikes me most about this phase of the engagement is not the technical execution. It is the silence on the Russian radio net. Between 5:31 and 5:47, the 412th Signals team recorded almost no voice traffic from the Crossing Forces Company net. Not panic, not calls for support, near silence. The most likely explanation, consistent with accounts from previous engagements in this sector, is that the vehicle commanders who survived the initial DPICM strikes had shifted to intercom-only communication, trying to avoid the Ukrainian signals intercept capability they almost certainly knew existed. The silence was tactical discipline, and it made no difference. By 5:55, 41 minutes after the crossing began, the 24th Brigade's forward observers reported that vehicle movement in the eastern approach corridor had stopped. The queue that had been building behind the DPICM strike zone was no longer moving forward. Some vehicles were attempting to reverse back along the axis they had used to reach the corridor. This is where the secondary FPV teams, positioned specifically for the withdrawal scenario, came into their own. The question every analyst asks about an engagement like this is, how many crews survived? The honest answer is that open-source evidence cannot give a precise number. What it can confirm, from drone footage reviewed by Deep State and cross-referenced against Ukrainian General Staff statements in the days following the engagement, is that a significant number of Russian airborne personnel abandoned their vehicles and withdrew on foot through the marshland east of the canal. Marshland is not friendly terrain for people in body armor carrying rifles. It is, however, survivable, which is why the casualty count from this engagement, while serious, is not as catastrophic in human terms as the equipment loss numbers suggest. The equipment numbers are what they are. At least 19 BMP-3 hulls confirmed inside the canal corridor by open-source imagery as of June 2025. Several are partially or fully submerged. The rest are burned or mine-damaged on the approach ramps and exit points. Oryx open-source data, which requires photographic confirmation for each entry, had cataloged 15 of those hulls with individual images by the time this script was completed. The others remain as thermal signatures on drone footage that has not yet produced the close-range visual needed for individual Oryx entries. The cost calculation is not academic. A BMP-3 at 2025 replacement cost runs approximately $3 to $3.5 million per hull, depending on the configuration variant. 19 hulls is somewhere between $57 and $66 million in armored vehicle losses in a single 9-hour engagement. The trained crews, the replacement training pipeline for airborne personnel qualified to operate BMP-3s in swim mode. Those costs do not appear in any spreadsheet, but they are real and they compound across every engagement like this one. If you have been following this sector seriously, and if you are still watching at this point, you have. Here is why this specific engagement matters beyond the local tactical outcome. Chasiv Yar sits on the high ground west of Bakhmut, and Russian military planning in the Donbas has consistently identified it as a necessary step toward the broader Kostiantynivka axis. The Siverskyi Donets-Donbas Canal is the dominant terrain feature between the Russian-held ruins of Bakhmut and the approaches to Chasiv Yar's western districts. Any Russian ground advance toward those districts has to cross the canal or go around it, and going around means exposure to the open ground north and south of the city where Ukrainian fires are even more effective. The 98th Guards Airborne's failure at this crossing does not end Russian attempts on the canal, but it confirms something tactically significant. The Ukrainian defense concept in this sector has matured to a level where Russian forces cannot achieve positional surprise through conventional armored maneuver. That concept is called sensor strike layering, and it is worth explaining precisely because the term gets used loosely. Sensor strike layering is not about having more drones than the enemy, though that matters. It is about connecting the sensors to the strike systems fast enough that the enemy's decision cycle, the time between their commander ordering a move and executing it, is always slower than your targeting cycle. In the Chasiv Yar Canal engagement, the Ukrainian targeting cycle from first radio intercept to first DPICM rounds was 9 minutes. 9 minutes from we know they're crossing to rounds in the air. That is not fast by the standards of a precision strike aircraft. But it was fast enough because the BMP-3 crossing force needed approximately 20 minutes to get its lead elements across the water and onto the western bank. Ukraine's 9-minute cycle meant the approach corridor was under fire before the crossing force was committed past the point of return. Here is the take that will probably draw some argument. The Russian airborne forces' failure here is not primarily a failure of courage or even of execution at the company level. The BMP-3 crews who entered that canal corridor in the pre-dawn hours of May 28th did what they were ordered to do and what their training prepared them to do. The failure is institutional. It sits with the planning staff who designed a crossing operation using doctrinal templates developed in the Soviet period when the dominant threat to a canal crossing was anti-tank missiles fired from dug-in positions on the far bank, not a layered surveillance network with sub-10-minute strike coordination. Those two threat environments require fundamentally different crossing concepts, and the 98th Airborne's planners chose not to adapt. Most people assume that Russian airborne units, being elite formations, would have developed countermeasures to Ukrainian drone spotting by this stage of the war. The evidence from this engagement suggests otherwise. There is no indication in the open-source record, no electronic warfare footprint, no smoke deployment in the approach corridors, no decoy vehicle movement on adjacent axes, that the 98th Airborne's crossing plan included any serious attempt to degrade Ukrainian sensor coverage before committing its main body to the canal. That is the institutional failure. Individual soldiers paid for it. What would a doctrine-adapted crossing look like? This is worth considering because Ukraine's defensive planners are certainly thinking about it. A sensor-aware canal crossing in 2025 would likely require multi-axis pressure to split Ukrainian FPV and artillery allocations, heavy EW jamming of drone frequencies in the approach corridors, smoke and obscurant deployment on a timeline calibrated to the known duty cycle gaps in Ukrainian UAV rotation, and engineering preparation of the exit ramps on the far bank before the main body enters the water, either by committing expendable breaching elements or by using indirect fire to damage the mining on the exit ramps before the swim force arrives. None of these are impossible. All of them are expensive in time and resources. They require coordination at a level that Russian tactical units in the Donbas have consistently struggled to sustain under Ukrainian fire's pressure. Would Russia have prevented this outcome if the 98th Airborne's plan had included a 24-hour EW suppression window before the crossing? Possibly. We cannot say with certainty because we do not know the full electronic order of battle that Ukrainian forces had positioned in depth behind the canal. What we do know is that the plan that was executed did not include it, and the absence of any jamming capability is visible in the radio intercept record, which shows Ukrainian signals teams picking up Russian voice traffic with apparent clarity throughout the engagement. A word on what the 24th King Danylo Brigade represents in the broader Ukrainian order of battle, because the unit deserves to be understood rather than just cited as a number. The 24th Mechanized Brigade is named for King Danylo of Galicia, the 13th century ruler who modernized the Principality of Galicia-Volhynia's military structures against Mongol pressure. An intentional historical reference in a war about sovereignty and survival. The brigade was reconstituted and expanded in the early months of the full-scale war, and has fought in multiple sectors of the Eastern Front. Its integration with the 412th Nemesis UAV Battalion is not a temporary attachment arrangement. The two units have operated together long enough to develop the kind of procedural trust, shared frequencies, shared targeting formats, shared expectations about response timelines that made the 9-minute intercept-to-fire cycle possible. That level of integration does not happen spontaneously. It is the product of months of deliberate, combined arms training and repeated combat experience in the same terrain. Comment below, do you think Russian airborne doctrine can actually adapt to sensor-saturated crossing scenarios within the current command structure, or is the institutional weight too heavy? We read every response and they shape what we investigate next. The aftermath of the May 28th engagement played out across several days of signals traffic, satellite imagery, and social media posting from Russian military accounts. The signals picture is fragmentary. Ukrainian intercept teams do not release raw communications publicly, and the material that has appeared in open sources is partial. But what is visible is consistent with a force that suffered a significant shock and was trying to understand what had happened. Russian milblogger accounts, which are sometimes the fastest source of honest tactical assessment on the Russian side, began posting about the Chasiv Yar Canal sector within hours of the engagement. The framing shifted over the course of the day from initial silence to acknowledgement of difficult conditions to, in several accounts, explicit criticism of the planning. One widely circulated post, subsequently deleted, referred to the crossing as a lesson in how not to use armored assets in conditions of continuous enemy observation. That post was archived by Ukrainian open-source researchers before deletion and has been quoted in several subsequent analyses. The satellite imagery available in the days following May 28th confirmed what the drone footage had suggested. The western embankment of the canal at the primary crossing point showed multiple vehicle hulls in positions consistent with mine detonation and FPV strike damage. The secondary crossing point to the north showed 2 additional hulls. Deep State's annotated map, updated over the following week as new imagery became available, marked 19 confirmed BMP-3 positions inside the corridor, with a note distinguishing between hulls confirmed by photographic evidence and those visible only in lower-resolution thermal drone footage. The strategic consequence of the engagement was immediate and measurable. Russian ground pressure on the western approaches to Chasiv Yar, which Ukrainian military observers had characterized as active but managed in the days before May 28th, went effectively dormant for the 2 weeks following the engagement. The 98th Guards Airborne's combat power in the sector degraded to the point where Russian ground forces reverted to artillery and FPV harassment rather than armored maneuver. Ukrainian General Staff reporting in early June 2025 described the Chasiv Yar axis as stabilized, military language for a line that is being contested but not broken. One detail that stays with me from the open-source record of this engagement is a piece of drone footage posted by the 24th Brigade's press unit approximately 6 hours after the crossing attempt ended. The footage is from a fixed-wing reconnaissance platform, probably a Lelika, flying east along the canal at altitude. You can see the western embankment from above, the blocked exit ramp, the burned hulls, the scorch marks on the concrete, and then, about 300 meters east of the main crossing point, you can see the tracks in the mud where BMP-3 crews crossed the marshland on foot, heading back toward the Russian line. The tracks run in a rough cluster, maybe 20 meters wide. A lot of people moving together in a hurry, the spacing of men who have just abandoned their vehicles and are trying to get somewhere that feels like safety. There is something about those tracks that the damage assessment numbers do not capture. This is what sensor strike layering actually produces at the human scale. Not a clean tactical diagram, but a set of boot prints in marshland heading east while 27 vehicles sit in various states of destruction behind them. Here is what this engagement tells us about the broader arc of the war in the Donbas. The canal crossing failure is not by itself decisive. Russia has the depth of equipment and the operational patience to attempt this axis again. perhaps with different timing, perhaps with some of the doctrinal adaptations discussed earlier. What the engagement confirms is that the Ukrainian defensive concept in this sector has matured to a level where Russian forces cannot achieve positional surprise through conventional armored maneuver. Every approach to every canal crossing point west of Chasiv Yar is now pre-mapped, pre-mined, and pre-targeted. The sensors and the strike systems are already networked. The timing cycle is already rehearsed. This is what Russian airborne doctrine, designed for the decisive rapid maneuver of a different era, runs into in 25. Not a wall, a system, and systems are much harder to defeat than walls. Similar problems with obstacle crossing doctrine confronted Soviet forces in Afghanistan and, more directly relevant, confronted both sides in the canal crossing battles of the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, where Egyptian forces managed the Bar-Lev line crossings precisely because they built a system around the crossing, suppressing Israeli air and anti-tank assets through coordinated timing before committing the main body to the water. The parallel is imperfect, the weapons are different, the terrain is different, the information environment is incomparable, but the underlying principle is the same. You cannot force a contested water obstacle with armored vehicles unless you have degraded the enemy's ability to observe the crossing and respond to it faster than you can complete it. Does the history of obstacle crossing failures in modern warfare suggest Russia will recognize this pattern and adapt, or does institutional doctrine always move too slowly for the battlefield it actually faces? For the 24th King Danylo Brigade and the 412th Nemesis Battalion, the question is different. They know the next crossing attempt will come. It may come at a different point along the canal. It may come with EW support the May 28th attempt lacked. It may come at night, in weather, with decoy operations on adjacent axes. The brigade's intelligence section, according to Ukrainian military reporting from early June, has already begun updating its pattern of life analysis for the Russian assembly areas east of the canal. The Lelika platforms are flying again. The FPV teams are restocked. The DPICM rounds are on the shelf. The canal is still there. So is the 24th Brigade. If this kind of granular OSINT breakdown is how you want to understand what is actually happening on the Donbas front, the tactical detail, the unit-level analysis, the open-source evidence behind the headlines, subscribe to Shadow Battlefield. Every week, we take one engagement, one system, one intelligence question, and we go as deep as the open-source record allows. No speculation dressed as fact, no propaganda dressed as analysis, just the evidence, the doctrine, and the questions the evidence raises. What do you think? Can Russian airborne doctrine adapt fast enough to change the outcome at the next canal crossing, or is the institutional structure too rigid to absorb this kind of tactical lesson before the front line shifts again? Drop your read in the comments. And if you want to see the satellite imagery analysis and the deep state map overlays that support this breakdown, the linked video in the description walks through the visual evidence frame by frame. The tracks in the mud are still there on the satellite image. Heading east, 27 vehicles short of where they started.